Okay, so I want to produce free YouTube presentations for your TMA07. First two, there will be quite a bit of iteration. The first presentation is based upon your guidelines, so I'm just going to read through basically your guidelines. Hopefully that will give you another perspective to think about what you need to do for your project. Don't forget that we got a cut-off of the 26th of April. So got good 3 weeks. We can still be working on the project. Don't forget that the module website gives details about details about the module, gives details about the, your TMA. Make reference to that as well. TMA answers must show full working. You might want to be using appendices in some derivations when things become a bit too involved, but on the whole, in the main body you should be showing step-by-step derivations. Make sure that your mathematical notation is correct. So review things for in particular typos when you're using the equation editor. Define all the symbols that are used. On some cases you might want to be using temporary symbols in the derivation, in which case it isn't necessary to have that at the beginning, but on the whole we want to have all the symbols used in the report defined at the beginning. Give references for formula, standard formula, and maybe standard deviation. So for example, I could think maybe you might want to use the range formula. So you can make a reference to that. Most likely it'll be a reference to a module book that you want to be using there. Derivation's the same thing. Okay, so there might be some sort of references that you want to be using there. So the pointer to. Okay. When you do your derivations, you should include commentary and explanation. Now, sometimes students go overboard commenting on obvious stuff, yeah, but the commentary should really just be a means to explain to the reader what the next step is. You don't have to go back to say I'm going to be using the dot product and that kind of thing. So you should assume some intelligence, mathematical background of your readership for your commentary. You don't have to go back to the fundamentals. It's a stage-by-stage explanation of what's going on in that derivation. Use an appropriate degree of accuracy. On the whole, in a derivation, I tend to work to 5 sig fig, and then present final answers to 3 sig fig. There might be some reasons to that is even less accurate. So, for example, they're my general rules of thumb, but you might want to be working or presenting answers to say 2 sig fig. That might be acceptable. Draw lots of diagrams, draw lots of graphs throughout your TMA. Try and illustrate stuff as much as possible in a visual sense. Far easier to wade through that than tables of data. Maybe tables of data stick into the appendix and then present your stuff in terms of diagrams and graphs. On the whole, avoid repetition within the body of text of data. So for example, if you have a table, you should be avoiding then having a graph there. Draw graphs and diagrams for your derivations. So this is actually what this is referring to here, really, more than anything. So when you do the derivation, you might want to incorporate a diagram of what your variables look like, and you might want to draw graphs again of what sort of properties we expect between variables as you go along. So you need to write a report pretty much hitting 2,000 words. Go over a little bit if you want. Don't exceed 3,000 words because there's a mandatory 10 marks penalty. If you go over, and on top of that, if you go over the 3,000 words, then tutors aren't supposed to be marking beyond 3,000 words. So you will have a 10% penalty point, and you'll also have nothing more marked past that point. Your report should have the following section headings, so you've got to have these. Maybe number them as well: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's always helpful. Start each section heading with a new page, so it's easy to find. Even though this is probably going to be barely a quarter of a page. Specify the purpose. Section heading 1. Create the model. Number 2. Do the mathematics. Number 3. Interpret the results. Number 4. And evaluates the model. Number 5. Revise the model. Number 6. And conclusions. Number 7. So we must have those section headings, and they must be written out using those terms. Create the model, do the maths, interpret the results, and what's the next two? Evaluate the model and revise the model. They might have subheadings. Now these aren't mandatory, but they're advised that you should have them. So for example, create the model, you could have these 4 subheadings. It'll make things easier for your marker to assess your work, so therefore I would strongly advise you to put them in. So create the model. You could rewrite these to make them a bit more sort of, this is a bit too long here. Describe features investigated and outline mathematics used. So I suppose that might be something that could be split up into 2 subheadings, or somehow make that heading a bit shorter. It's a bit long-winded as it stands. State the assumptions. Choose the variables and parameters. So variables and parameters. Choose, obviously. Formulate mathematical relationships. So that's fair enough as a heading or a subheading. And do the mathematics. You want a subheading for deriving your first model, for showing that you've done some graphs showing relationships between your variables, and a section where you're checking the dimensional analysis. In the interpret the results, you might be looking for 3 subheadings. So 1, which is related to collecting relevant data for parameter values. 1 which is describing the mathematical solution. And finally 1 which is talking about predictions, comparing with reality. The last 2 section headings that might require splitting up into subsection headings is evaluate the model. So that one will have collecting data to test the model, you testing your model there, making criticisms of it, and then you start to review assumptions. In the revise the model, there's possibly 2 subheadings that you might have, one related to whether you decide to revise or think that the models are brilliant. 1 where you describe some intended revision, and whatever you decide here, you will still have this subheading, because an intended revision could be making the model more complicated, or it could just be making the model more simplified. General advice. So if it's possible, describe the model derived by the modeling group. I know not everyone was completely successful with their subgroups, but even if that was the case, then you describe why you wasn't successful. Okay, so you can let rip, blame the organization, how it was set up, if you like that. So all of those things would be fair comments. Other than section headings, you're free to express yourself. Okay, so those, as I said, I've recommended some subsection headings for you to be using, or themes to base subsection headings around. And if you want to write in first person, third person, that's all acceptable. Obviously, it does get a better feel if you do try to go for a more formal third person, the report, as opposed to I did this, I did that. But you know, you won't be marked down for it, although it does give the marker a different impression of your approach. And they will be looking for whether you're being systematic. So if writing in third person tends to give that impression that you're being more systematic. Lay out the work in a logical fashion. No surprises. Describe each step clearly. This is both in terms of when you're deriving things, and also if you're doing subsection headings and you want to segue sections from one to another to explain how one section leads onto another, with a leading comment and a final comment. Use appropriate references. References very important. Diagrams and tables. Too much commentary without mathematics can be very difficult to read. So some students feel more is better here, but it then just becomes a very tedious task to get through, and you do have a reasonably tight limit, really. So you want to save your commentary for other things to maximize your marks. So don't go into too much details of explaining the fundamentals of your mathematics. You want to be explaining more the process of I'm now doing this, I'm now doing that. Write concisely as you can. Assume good mathematical background of the reader. So as I said, although you want to be referencing maybe a standard deviation of a range property, I can imagine that sort of thing for this particular TMA, but you don't have to make a reference, I suppose, to a dot product or whatever, something like that. Take every opportunity to include figures and illustrations and include figures and illustrations as you go along in your derivation, explaining variables, explaining potential results of those variables as well. Give plenty of sketches of graphs, drawings and diagrams. Present data and variables in tables, where possible, that is. Sometimes you might just have one result, in which case obviously a table is not sensible. Before you submit your TMA, they recommend that you go through this 13-point checklist. So let's run through it. Point 1. Have you got a clear statement of the problem that you're solving? Don't copy out or even, I think, use as a basis the problem brief from the assignment. So make sure that it's in your own words. Number 2, outline the main features without mathematics. Okay, so you want a description of the features that you're solving. Have a numbered list of assumptions. I quite like assumptions being referenced as A1, A2, A3, because then it's easy to then, when you look at the those terms in the report, to recognize what's what. In your assumptions, make sure that you've removed any numbers. From your featured list, drawing up assumptions, it's very easy to then incorporate assumptions that aren't actually referred to in the report. On the whole, the majority of the assumptions will be referred to in formulating the model, but the assumptions might be referred to elsewhere. So have a tick off that assumption has been mentioned somewhere in the report. And I suppose you might be on dodgy ground if the assumption is in an appendix section there. So that could quite easily happen, in which case the marker might regard that assumption as not being used in the report. So make sure that they are all referred to somewhere in the report. Sometimes during the derivation, assumptions have crept in, so check that no assumption has crept into the report and that have not been given in the list at the beginning. Make sure you define all the variables and parameters. The one exception is that if you're using maybe a temporary variable which you have defined in your derivation, like let phi equal this collection of terms. Of course, we don't want temporary variables in that sense to be at the beginning, but other than that, all the other variables that you're using should be there. Read through the English, maybe read out your report. That's a good way. I doubt anyone will have a loved one or partner that would read through it, but if you do, that, so much the better. Derive the first model without data values. Okay, talk about this a bit more later. Sanity check your answers. Do they form within a range of what sounds sensible, plausible? If not, then you've done something wrong, and we certainly should be reporting results that are sane. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to. Consider special cases. So, for example, if we're considering roofs, I suppose special cases we need to consider are flat roofs, maybe steep roofs or something like this. So special cases. Made credible predictions. When you come to the revision, you should be only revising your model so that it improves the initial predictions, and you shouldn't be going for things that actually make your predictions worse. In terms of the marking scheme, so we have 5 marks where you detail your postings on the modeling forum. Okay. So as I said, some of you found using the modeling forum, working in the wiki group, difficult, in which case then you talk about why you found it difficult, how it could be improved, and stuff like that. So that's what you want to do there. Specify, so you don't just throw the 5 marks away. Specify the purpose, 5 marks. So as I said, avoid taking the assignment brief text and rejigging it. Specify the purpose from your own head, from your experience. So this might be something that you want to do at the end, really. Have a clear, distinct statement of what the specific problem is that you're solving. So this is all in words, avoiding any mathematical terms. Create the model. We have 30 marks here. The majority of your marking is based around the model process that you're going through, not the model. So that's why we have a lot of marks associated with creating the model. Now, not hard and fast rules here, but basically we have breakdown of marks for those 30 marks. So we have 5 marks associated with describe features investigated and outline mathematics used. So what's this mean? So describe your main features you are investigating. That's the sort of first thing we did. Give a qualitative description of the approach. So we're avoiding mathematics here. We're saying what's going to be solved, as if you're talking to a layman really, of what you're, or like a news reporter, a reporter, imagine something like that, and that's the sort of description you're looking for. How is the first model formulated? So what are your variable parameters and approach going to be used to formulate the model? 7 marks for stating assumptions. So we have a numbered list of stated assumptions. As I said, A1, A2 is probably a good way of referencing them, so to identify an assumption easily like that. Do not miss assumptions or include unused assumptions, so you get them marked down for either of those points. And do not incorporate any numbers in your assumptions, they shouldn't appear there. Choose the variables and parameters. Some of you might want to separate your variables and parameters. That's a good plan if you can do it, not essential though. 5 marks associated. So we're going to have a nice table of symbols used in the model and significant terms in the derivations. For each symbol we're going to have a clear definition and we're going to state its units. Consider having variables and parameter lists, okay, separated, but if it becomes an issue, don't worry about it, just incorporate them all together. Look at other research reports and how they list variables. You might want to have like a list of variables there and then at the end list of superscripts, subscripts, or you might want to list your variables incorporating subscripts and superscripts as you go along. If you have variables which use subscripts, for example, the classic one would be a velocity. So let's say we're going to use u as a velocity or a v. Now we might want to have v maximum. So subscript, that's a logical variable for that for me would be v subscript max, as opposed to v subscript little m or v subscript 2. So make it as meaningful as possible when you're using your variables. Formulate mathematical relationships. So we've got 13 marks here. So what we're doing is we're deriving relationships between your variables and your parameters, and we're explaining how the equations follow from your assumptions and you reference your assumptions. It's quite difficult to know when formulate mathematical relationships and the next section starts, decide from where to where. Okay, so you won't be penalized too much if you get the position wrong, if you slightly have formulated too much or slightly under formulated, so don't worry too much about it. Okay, so that's what I'm going to say there. As I said, formulation might slip over into doing the mathematics where we've got 10 marks. So here we're deriving the first model, so we're carrying on the previous section. So ideally we've kind of, I don't know, let's say we've set up an integral that we need to solve. And here in doing the mathematics we're actually integrating. So that's the kind of difference that we're looking for. Focus on the variable of interest that you're trying to solve. So if I'm looking at a car stopping distance, the variable of interest is the stopping distance. If I'm looking at something falling off a roof, maybe the variable of interest is how far it falls from the roof from the base of the house. What other terms and variables can be predicted? So the velocity of the car, the velocity of the falling object, so on. Derive the mathematical model. Now this might not necessarily be an explicit equation, so we might have a variable of interest range, but in fact to solve that we have to go through a process of solving 2 or 3 equations. So we might have that's why we're calling it mathematical model as opposed to mathematical equation, if you like, because it might be a procedure that we go through to find the result. If it's a procedure that we go through, more than likely it's heading towards maybe some kind of numerical solution. If it's an equation, probably it will have an analytical solution, but again, an equation might be something that's not solvable where we have a numerical solution. It might be 2 equations where we're trying to maximize something, so again we might be looking at a numerical solution there and not an analytical solution. Don't include any particular data values at this point. When you're doing stuff like this, coming up with the mathematics, draw graphs. I'm sorry, actually this is a next stage when we've established this first model. So when we've established the first model, we need to have a subsection, where we're drawing graphs showing the relationships between certain properties. So for a car stopping, how I'd expect the velocity and the stopping distance to be having a relationship. For something falling off a roof, how I expect maybe the angle of attack of the roof from the horizontal to the roof position, how that might affect the range. So sketching graphs of the relationship between properties is what I should be looking for here. This might be something that you might want to use a computer program for. Avoid it if you can, and for certain things you might have to therefore consider typical values. So that's kind of acceptable at this stage to be using that in particular for your parameter values. Finally, going to have a section where you're checking the dimensional analysis of your results. So any equations that you've derived, you're going to check the dimensional analysis. Then we go into next section here, which is interpret results. There's 10 marks here. So that requires collecting data for the parameter values. So acceleration of gravity, I don't know, and whatever other parameter values that you might want to have for your model. So there's certain things that you might not want to vary, such as, I suppose, maybe the height or the angle of the roof. Parameter data is probably best found from the internet. So let's say you decide that the parameter value is the angle of the roof, and you're going to base that upon building regulations, for example. I mean, that's the thing that comes to my mind. Stopping distance, then you might base that on highway code. So that's how something that might have first appear as a variable might actually be a parameter, and those parameter values will be based upon maybe some sort of like regulation which you'll probably find on the internet. If you do, make sure that you reference those sources and parameters you might want to obtain from simplified experiments. Or so this might be that you an experiment could also include, let's say we're going for angle of roof, that you measure the angle of a roof. So that's something like that. So we could be doing that kind of experiments, and any sort of like raw data evidence that you've done that you then want to stick in an appendix. Describe the mathematical solution. So clearly state in words what you expect the solution to be. Description should be understandable to a layperson. So we've initially told the layperson at the beginning of our project what we're going off to examine, and then we're going to describe them what the solution is that we've come up with. You want to give instructions or guidelines at this point. So you are forming instructions of, let's say, the maximum distance that we will be predicting, and then we want to make predictions and then compare them with reality, which kind of leads us on to the next section where we're evaluating the model, and we've got 15 marks here. So here we're testing values that the model is going to give us. So we need to collect some data to compare it with our model. So go off and collect your data to test your model. Data should be referenced. Most likely this is going to come from simple experiments. Again, it might also come from, let's say if we're looking at things falling from roofs, stopping distances of cars, it might also come from sort of building regs that or highway codes, those kind of things, where you could be testing your results against. Test your model, i.e. make predictions, and consider describing tests that you would like to do. So for example, climbing up at the top of a tower block and dropping something off, it might be something I'd like to do, but for various reasons you can quite clearly see that it's not a possibility. Criticize your first model. What things have you not considered which clearly are present? Is it giving you good results? Is it easy to solve? Could a layperson use it? These are all things that you could go about criticizing. Review your assumptions. So consider each assumption and explain its effect on the model, and if it's really going to be that significant or not. What assumptions could improve the fit to test the data? So if we're predicting, for example, that the object has a range which is too long, then an assumption that we could be looking at is maybe introducing air resistance. I would expect that that would then reduce the range. Or maybe the friction, maybe, I don't know, maybe you haven't included friction on the roofs. I slow down the object as it comes off a roof. So these are we're looking at things then that will slow down the object. If however we are under predicting those things, then we should probably be looking at other assumptions, such as maybe we have included friction, but the friction we're using is based upon static friction and not dynamic friction. So if the object isn't going far enough, it might be because we haven't included dynamic friction, which we should be using, and therefore it will then go further as it falls off the roof. So finally, 10 marks for revising the model. Decide whether you need to revise the model. Maybe you can bang on results, they're perfect. In which case, then you should consider making it simpler, or how it can be incorporated, I don't know, in regs or something like this. So some sort of revision should always be achievable. If your results are a bit out, then look at what is the best candidate assumption or assumptions that you want to change to improve the model. Describe your intended revision, how that's going to be included in your model Mark II. But as part of this, review all the assumptions and replace or revise appropriately. So there might be assumptions for model Mark II where you need to introduce more assumptions. There might be assumptions which can clearly be removed. Adjust parameter values if you want to or think that's required, but that would not be considered a model revision. Coming back to my example of dynamic versus static friction, it would be a bit debatable really there if that would be a model revision, because we would assumably just be changing the mu, the coefficient of friction value. So whether that would be a model revision or not, I think it's a bit debatable. Revision is focused on improving predictions and data comparisons. So we're only looking really, well, and actually not we're only looking at, but we're looking at improving the predictions and data comparisons. Revision also might be looking at simplifying how the model can be used. Finally, we want to have a conclusion section where you summarize your modeling, summarize the performance of the first model, say how well that performed, describe how it can be improved, comment on your approach to the modeling process, and finally, this is very important for a conclusion section, do not introduce anything new. Okay, it's very tempting to talk about further work. Sometimes you write reports saying new things that you might attempt, but this report is assuming that you do not do that. So do not include anything new into the conclusion section. It's merely reporting, highlighting, if you like, things that you've seen in the previous sections in your report. Okay, so that's my first presentation. I'm going to do, as I said, 3 presentations in total. The next presentation will be based upon, again, guidelines, but guidelines from a tutor's perspective. And then the third presentation will look at some extracts of old TMAs and things, nice features that I like from them.